I've read the Lord of the Rings trilogy before, but it's been a very long time. I read it for the first and only previous time as a ninth grader. It was assigned for my ninth grade English class. As required reading for English class goes, it definitely was more enjoyable than some, but I didn't really love it at the time. I wasn't really very enthusiastic about the idea of reading it, and sometimes, your attitude and your interest in something can make all the difference about how you perceive it. So I really was not very impressed with The Lord of the Rings the first time that I read it, but I do generally like the fantasy genre and stories that follow the hero's journey, and so I wanted to revisit it to see what I would see in it now that maybe I didn't when I was 14 years old. The Lord of the Rings trilogy follows Frodo, a young hobbit who finds that he is in possession of the One Ring, basically this powerful magical object that needs to be destroyed to prevent Sauron, the villain of the story, from having complete control over Middle-earth. I've been thinking as I reread them about why I didn't like them very much when I tried them the first time, and maybe how my perspective has changed over time, or in some cases how it hasn't. I'm not really a huge fan of lots of fantasy battle scenes. Battle scenes are an important part of the fantasy genre, and in a lot of cases, these kind of epic fantasy type stories, you couldn't really tell without the battles. But the battles are not really what I'm here for. In the same way that I like the Star Wars movies, at least some of them, but I'm not really a huge fan of the space battles. I don't think that you could take that part out and still have it be a complete story and make sense. So, it's necessary and it's an important part of the story, just not my favorite part of it. There were some things that I liked about the battles. I liked the part where the king of the Nazgul can't be killed by any man, and then is killed by a woman assisted by a hobbit, neither of which is a human man. And it kind of links back to the thing in Macbeth, doesn't it? Where Macbeth can't be killed by any man born of woman, and then he's killed by a man who was born from a C-section. It's kind of a similar concept, and I think I've read that Tolkien actually was influenced by Macbeth in that, as well as the scene with the Ents marching on Isengard. So yeah, there is some of the stuff with the fantasy battles that I did enjoy. And I wouldn't say that they were a major negative for me, just the stuff that I liked the best often was in other parts of the story. I also found that it was very slow moving at times, for instance at the beginning it takes forever just to get out of the Shire. And it's a big deal the hobbits leaving the Shire because they've never been away from it. But it doesn't feel like it should have to take quite as long as it does. And it just, I get to the point where I'm ready to just be done with that part of it. The world building obviously is very intricate and well done and fascinating, and I think that's one of the best parts about it. You learn so much, not just about the world as you're passing through it, but the history of it, and the poetry, and the languages, and the mythology, and everything that has to do with, what makes a place unique. In some places, I felt like there was a little bit too much just kind of dumped on the reader. For instance, in Bree, I think it's interesting to learn about how the humans and the hobbits kind of live side by side in Bree and all of that, but it just goes on for a little bit long and gets a little bit too in-depth for me. But overall, I really do like the world building. It feels like a place that has a history and that actually is pretty unique given that Tolkien's work is kind of the template for the standard fantasy setting. One thing though that I felt like was missing from the world building is the role of the women. There are very few female characters. Really just Galadriel, Arwen, and Éowyn are the ones that I can think of. And while they do play kind of interesting roles, it left me wondering, where are all the other women? Because we see so many men doing so many different things, and, it's a medieval setting. So in that way, probably women wouldn't have as diverse, career paths or things like that. They might not be as likely to be in the battle scenes, although Éowyn definitely is. But, where are they, though? Surely there are queens as well as kings, and people have daughters as well as sons, and it just seems like women are very absent from the world. So that's one place where I felt like the world building could have been a little bit better. However, in order to fix that, you would either need to change the gender of some existing characters, which might or might not work, or you would need more characters. And there are already too many. So that sounds like a lot of negativity, but actually, there were a lot of pleasant surprises as well when I reread The Lord of the Rings. One of the things that I really enjoyed about it was following along the hero's journey. I talked actually about The Lord of the Rings when I did my hero's journey videos back in January, and I remembered a lot then actually about how the hero's journey plays into the story from reading it quite a while ago. But at the time, I was only partway through. I read these over the course of several months because, they're rather long. In any case, having done so much work on the hero's journey recently, it was very enjoyable to see it play out in the Lord of the Rings books this time around. I also liked the parts of the story that dealt more with characters and character relationships and kind of developing, particularly I liked Frodo as a character and his friendship with Sam and his kind of temptation by the ring. I thought that that was a really compelling storyline. The whole trek through Mordor to destroy the ring. I also was surprisingly interested in the elves this time. As you can see from my choice of outfit with the little elf ears and everything, I actually found the elves to be really fascinating this time around, which I didn't before. I actually thought that the elves were kind of boring when I read these books in high school. But this time around, I thought that it was really interesting, just the concept of they were given these 3 rings that are linked to the one ring, just like the humans and dwarves were. But they used theirs in a very different way, whereas the humans who took the rings became the Nazgul, the elves who took the rings used them for good, basically. Galadriel, for instance, using hers to create this peaceful, idyllic elf kingdom in the woods. And then the idea that all the good that they've done with them will kind of fade away once the One Ring is destroyed. But they're willing to help destroy it anyway. I liked the romance between Aragorn and Arwen and the idea of an immortal falling in love with a human. I liked the whole concept of the age of the elves is coming to an end, and they know that, and everybody knows that, and kind of the role that that plays in the story. Because the elves' kingdoms are portrayed as being very idealized, very perfect even. And the idea that it can't last. I don't know, that I would be kind of prone to criticize the idea of like the elves' world being too perfect and them being too flawless and whatnot, but the idea that it can't last and it's coming to an end puts this bittersweet twist on it that I think actually justifies the kind of over-idealization of it. The other thing that I loved was the ending. And I do remember the ending from before. I remembered Frodo getting on the ship with the elves and them sailing off and everything. I really liked it this time around. I just got such a feeling of, like, it's bittersweet. Yes, Sauron is defeated, and yes, Aragorn was crowned king, and most of the characters find their way to relatively happy endings, but it's also so bittersweet because an age is coming to an end, and all of the elves kind of sailing off, and I don't know that I understood before that the elves' ships were kind of metaphorical or symbolic of death. I don't think that I quite got that. And Frodo with the whole thing about, like, he set out to save the Shire and he did save it, but it's not the place for him anymore. And he doesn't belong there anymore. That just, oh my gosh. I think that if everything had just been happily ever after, it would have been a letdown. Because even though, yeah, happy endings are nice and everything, the books were too serious. They explored complex, dark, difficult topics in too much depth to just have it all be like a Disney movie ending. At the same time, though, a tragic ending wouldn't have been satisfying either. If Frodo had succumbed to the power of the ring and not been able to destroy it, and Sauron had taken it back and ruled over Middle-earth with an iron fist and everybody suffered and died tragically, that would not be a good ending. So, kind of this middle ground of, yes, we saved the day, we destroyed the ring, Aragorn is king, and things are going to be better going forward. But then also, not everything ends well. I really liked that. I thought that it was very effective and well done. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, I didn't particularly like the character of Gollum. He was just very unpleasant to read about. But I did think it was very interesting how he kind of acts as a foil to Frodo. Because Gollum is someone who found the ring and used it and embraced it and became this horrifying, creepy little creature. And that's what could happen to Frodo if he's not lucky, if he's not careful, if he doesn't make the right choices, if he lets himself be too strongly affected by the power of the ring. So I think kind of seeing in Gollum an image of what Frodo could have become, depending on how he had handled the ring and the power that comes with it. I think that that's very effective in that it makes you appreciate Frodo's strength of character and the decisions that he makes so much more and helps to understand why at the end he is so tempted by the ring. Because it does have a very strong corrupting power, and we actually do see that. So usually in these videos, as well as just talking about my general opinions, I talk about what you might be surprised by and who I would recommend it for. One thing that I think you might find surprising about The Lord of the Rings is how much darkness and moral ambiguity and complicated fantasy politics there are. Because I often see The Lord of the Rings referenced as kind of a super squeaky clean, everything is sunshine and rainbows kind of fantasy story, in contrast to the more dark and gritty modern fantasy stories like Game of Thrones, for instance. Now, I have not read A Song of Fire and Ice or watched Game of Thrones, so, I only know it by what I've heard people say about it. And from what I have heard, it does go quite a bit more dark and gory and unpleasant and definitely more mature themes. But I think you might be surprised by some of the stuff that goes on in Lord of the Rings, particularly relating to the Steward of Gondor and his sons, and the corrupting power of the One Ring. Because Lord of the Rings is kind of often referred to as an example of a fantasy world where everything is a little bit more kind of black and white morality and clear-cut right and wrong situations and epic good versus evil conflicts, which all of that, the good versus evil and that kind of thing, that is there definitely. As far as who I would recommend it for, I think if you like the fantasy genre, at some point you're probably going to want to read Lord of the Rings. Even if it's not really your cup of tea, even if the whole epic fantasy thing isn't really your cup of tea, it played such a huge part in the history of the fantasy genre and the development of the fantasy genre as we know it today, that I really think it's worth reading even if it doesn't turn out to be your favorite thing in the world, just to see kind of where a lot of the ideas that we have today about fantasy worlds, where they got started or where they kind of took on a more modern form or things like that. I think that definitely when you read it, you'll be able to see its influence on other fantasy stories that you might have enjoyed. If you're not a fan of the fantasy genre, I wouldn't recommend it. So I guess that's my 2 cents as far as who I would recommend it for. People who really like fantasy novels. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe. I post new videos on Mondays and Thursdays.